Hey everyone, so today we're going to cover chapter 16, which is the endocrine system, which is the first chapter of AMP2. And this is a different chapter in that it's not necessarily a traditional organ system like we talked about in AMP1 when we talked to, for example, the nervous system or the skeletal system. The endocrine system is unique because it kind of is a cluster of organs involved in hormonal regulation. So our plan for today is we're going to talk about the endocrine system as an overview. We'll talk about hormones, and then we're going to jump into the different organs and the hormonal regulation of these organs. We'll talk about the major organ glands, or endocrine glands, and then we'll talk about hormone secretion by other organs. So the objectives list here is located here. Again, the objectives list is kind of like your study guide. Okay, so when I'm writing quizzes or exams, I have the objectives list next to me, and I'm writing my questions based off of the objectives. So again, make sure you guys are looking at the objectives lists as you study and as you go through the different presentations. So when we look at the endocrine system, it acts very similar to the nervous system, with the exception that the endocrine system is not quite as fast as the nervous system. So the nervous system is super fast, short-lived. The endocrine system is fast in the sense of tangible time when we think about time, but is much slower than the endocrine than the nervous system, but much more long-lived. It does work in conjunction with the nervous system in that most of the glands of the endocrine system release hormones in response to a nervous system stimulation. And what these hormones do is they will activate or influence a number of metabolic processes that are going to happen within the body. So, for example, hormones will be released and have an effect on reproduction. This is not just sexual reproduction, but this is things such as cell division. Okay, we can have hormones that influence growth and development. So when we talk about growth spurts in our early adolescence, early adulthood, these events are really driven by hormones that we'll talk about here in a little while. Maintenance of electrolytes, things such as calciums and potassium and sodium. These are all electrolytes. Water and nutrient balance is all controlled by hormonal regulation. Different cellular metabolism, so how we carry out our chemical reactions and energy balance is also carried out or controlled by hormonal regulations, as well as mobilization of our body defenses. When we think about that, we automatically maybe think back to the autonomic nervous system that we learned about in AMP1. And about the fight and flight response, or the sympathetic nervous system, which is driven by epinephrine and norepinephrine, two hormones we'll learn about in this chapter as well. So when we look at kind of the secretion of hormones, okay, there are two types of major glands that exist in the body. And we briefly touched on these when we talked about the integumentary system. So we have exocrine glands, and exocrine glands are going to produce non-hormonal substances. These are things such as sweat and saliva. And again, we looked at these, at least in terms of sweat, our sebaceous glands back in the integumentary system, chapter 5 of AMP1. When we talk about the exocrine glands, okay, this is an example over here of an exocrine gland. What you can see is that they have these ducts, and these ducts will secrete their substances onto the surface of that structure. Okay, how endocrine glands are different is, one, they're going to produce a hormone. Okay, so any structure or any organ or gland in the body that is able to produce a hormone has endocrine function. Now, not every organ is an endocrine gland. So, for example, what I mean by that is the heart, for example, can secrete a hormone known as ANP, which we'll talk about later. Even though the heart is part of the cardiovascular system, okay, it's not part of the endocrine system. However, it does have endocrine function because it can produce a hormone. Okay. Now, your endocrine glands also lack ducts, so they do not look like this structure. Instead, they're going to secrete their substances most likely into the bloodstream, where they're going to be able to circulate throughout the entire body. So when we look at the organ systems of, or the organs of the endocrine system, we have a number of structures that are considered endocrine glands. So the pituitary gland, which is located here in the brain, it's this kind of structure that hangs off of the inferior aspect of the hypothalamus. Again, going back to AMP1, some of you may remember that structure when we studied the brain. We have the thyroid gland, which is located here in the neck region. Okay, the parathyroid gland, which is located on the posterior aspect, the backside of this thyroid gland, basically consists of a number of dots that sit on the back of that. The adrenal glands, these are located on the superior aspect of our kidneys. Okay, they actually have no relationship or no interaction with the kidney itself. And then the pineal gland. The pineal gland is kind of the posterior aspect of the corpus callosum, and is located in the brain as well. Now we have a structure that has neuroendocrine function, and the reason it's identified or kind of classified as a neuroendocrine function is the hypothalamus is part of the endocrine system in that it secretes hormones. However, it's a neural tissue. Okay, so this is why it's considered kind of a neuroendocrine and does not kind of fall into this endocrine gland structure. And we'll talk about the importance of the hypothalamus, and it's really kind of the central kind of component to the endocrine system here in a little while. Now, there are some glands in our body that have actually both exocrine and endocrine function. So they secrete substances that aren't hormones through a duct, and they secrete substances that are hormones not through the duct. Okay, and these are things such as the pancreas, okay, which is located here. It's this kind of tongue-like structure. It actually overlays the stomach, kind of lays behind it if you were to draw the stomach on here, and then the small intestines come off right there. Okay, our gonads. Now, our gonads are both male and female reproductive organs, such as the ovaries or the testes. A lot of students have a preconceived notion that gonads are strictly meant for or classify or identify the testes, but gonads are actually females actually have gonads too, which are the ovaries, and then the placenta. And again, placenta is what is formed during pregnancy to support and sustain the life of the developing fetus. Okay. Now again, I had mentioned on the previous slide that one of the previous slides, that there are organs or tissues that secrete hormones, okay, but they're not necessarily part of the endocrine system. Okay, so for example, adipose tissue, okay, or adipose cells. Adipose tissue can actually secrete hormones. So although it's not necessarily an endocrine organ, it has endocrine function because it secretes a hormone. Our thymus, which is actually part of the lymphatic system or the immune system, also has endocrine function. The cells in the walls of the small intestines, again, small intestines being part of the digestive system, however, those cells, there's a certain population of cells that are going to secrete hormones. So those have endocrine function. The stomach, the kidneys, and I had already mentioned previously, the heart. Now, when we look at how hormones act or their mechanism of action overall within the body, okay, hormones are able to circulate systemically throughout the body, and this is why kind of you have a systemic targeting of cells within the body. However, because these hormones are circulating through the bloodstream, okay, you may not want every cell in the body to respond to that hormone. So what happens, what really specifies the site of action of a hormone is the receptor located on the cell. Okay, so for example, you may release a hormone It's circulating through the whole body, okay? But you may only have receptors for that hormone on your bone, okay? So even though that receptor, that hormone is circulating through our pancreas and our stomach and our heart, okay, those tissues will be unaffected, okay, because only the target tissue contains the receptor. Now, for those of you who are like, oh my God, I don't even remember what a receptor is, remember we have our phospholipid bilayer, which is our plasma membrane, right, to our cell. Okay, and embedded in here we have proteins. Okay, so here's, for example, a protein. And this protein here can be a receptor. And what it can have is it can kind of have a little thing up here, right? So as our hormones are circulating through our body, what will happen is this will bind to a receptor, and then there'll be an internal response. Okay, so what hormones can do is they can kind of do a number of things. And again, the whole purpose of a hormone is to trigger some type of activity within that cell. So, for example, it may alter the plasma membrane permeability. Okay, so the binding of this hormone to this receptor may allow certain things to enter the cell or prevent certain things from entering the cell. Okay. It can stimulate synthesis of enzymes and proteins. So the binding of this hormone to this receptor may turn on transcription and translation within the cell. Remember, converting that DNA to messenger RNA and then to a protein. Okay. It can activate or deactivate enzymes. It can induce secretory activity. So for example, you may have a hormone that binds to a receptor that causes this cell to make another hormone, which then causes that cell to secrete that hormone. Okay? Kind of crazy to think of all those little things that this single hormone can do. And the last thing hormones can do, and again, these are the major things that it can do, is stimulate mitosis. And again, mitosis, if we go back and we look at mitosis, this is cell division. Okay? So, in terms of how hormones will interact with their target cell, there's two kind of broad classifications or broad mechanisms for how hormones work. And it's based on whether a hormone is water soluble or lipid soluble. Now I want you guys to take a flashback back to ANP1. And we, again, bringing up that notion of our plasma membrane. Okay, because again, when we talk about a target cell, we're talking about the interaction of this hormone in conjunction with this plasma membrane. Remember, this is our phospholipid bilayer. And remember, these are our hydrophilic heads, right? We love water. And this is our hydrophobic tail that hates water. Okay, so we have loving water. I can't really read that, so I'm going to rewrite it, right? So we have our love on the outside and our hate in the middle. Okay, and as mentioned in ANP1, these hydrophobic tails, these regions that hate water, are much larger, even though structurally it doesn't look like that. Okay, so what'll happen is, as a hormone's coming along, right? So here's our hormone, chugging along. Okay, if this is water soluble, which means it loves water, when it gets to the cell target, it's going to be repelled. It cannot enter through that cell. Okay, so what it has to rely on is it has to rely on a receptor. Okay, so water soluble, okay, water loving, cannot get into the cell, and it has to rely on a receptor. So we have a schematic down here on the right hand side. So here is our receptors. These are our receptors here. Okay, and these are examples of water soluble receptors. Now again, because they can't go through this plasma membrane, they're prevented from getting to the inside of this cell. So what happens is they bind to this receptor, okay, and it activates a cascade of events. Essentially, all I want you to know at this point is it activates something called a G protein second messenger. Don't necessarily have to memorize, or not necessarily, do not memorize all these different steps. Essentially, I just want you to realize that the hormone activates or binds to a receptor. The receptor activates a protein. And it's ultimately the activation of this protein that activates another protein, that activates another protein, that has an internal consequence within the side of the cell. So we kind of see this over here, right? So here's our hormone, it activates the receptor, and then the receptor activates the protein, activates an enzyme, and has a different second messenger, and this goes off to do one of these events, or multiple of those events there. Okay? Now, if a hormone is lipid soluble, right, that means a lipid soluble hormone, okay, so here's our lipid soluble hormone cruising along. Oh, I can go through because I am a lipid and I am not repelled by these little tails, okay. So our lipid soluble hormones, they can enter the cell, okay. And what they do once they're inside the cell, so they don't need a receptor to carry out that signaling we just saw. Instead, what they do is they enter the cell, okay, because they go right through that plasma membrane, and they bind to a receptor, which is a protein inside this cell. Now, this hormone cell complex or receptor complex will typically enter into the nucleus and actually drive metabolic activities. So it will activate genes and cause transcription. Here's our transcription. And translation, right, where we're making new proteins. It can also drive other processes. So it can drive us to increase our metabolic reactions, so it can increase ATP production or decrease ATP production, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, how hormones are released, okay, there's actually 3 different ways in which we can stimulate hormones to be released, okay. Now, again, the majority of these hormones are being released into the bloodstream, and because hormones have such a dramatic effect within our body, we need to be able to control the levels of hormones within our blood, and we do that through a negative feedback system. Okay, we're not going to talk about every single negative feedback system, but we are going to talk about a number of kind of hormonal pathways today, and on a few of them, we'll talk specifically about what happens when they go out of whack. Okay, but first, let's look at the 3 types of ways in which a hormone can be stimulated and released from a structure, okay, or a gland, okay? So we can have humoral stimuli, neural stimuli, and hormonal stimuli, okay? Now, intuitively, right, we can see these words. Neural stimuli is going to be the nervous system. Hormonal stimuli is going to be a hormone. But humoral isn't maybe necessarily as intuitive. So when we look at a humoral stimuli, and again, this is the stimulus that's causing, the type of stimulus that's causing a gland or an endocrine structure to release a hormone. Okay? So for example, when we talk about humoral stimuli, okay, these are changing blood levels of an ion or nutrient. Okay? So things such as calcium, sodium, potassium, bicarbonates, so on and so forth. Okay, those are just a few. And nutrients, so things, the big one being glucose, amino acids, okay, fatty acids, okay. So changes in any of these, and again, there's more than just what I showed here, okay, cause the secretion of hormones. So for example, okay, we talked about blood calcium homeostasis in AMP1. We talked about its role in maintaining, or basically how it targets osteoclast activity to basically chew away at the bone to release calcium. Okay, so in this case, what's happening is in this humoral stimuli, the body is basically constantly detecting the levels of calcium. And when calcium levels decrease, okay, this right here, here's our humoral stimuli, okay? This decrease in calcium will be sensed by the parathyroid hormone, or by the parathyroid glands on the backside of the thyroid gland, okay? And this decrease will cause the release of PTH, parathyroid hormone. Okay. Now, parathyroid hormone causes our calcium concentrations to rise and stimulus is then removed. Okay. Again, this is an example of a negative feedback, and we'll get more specifically into that pathway here in a little while. Okay. So that's humoral. Okay. Ions and nutrients. Our neurostimuli is a nerve fiber that will stimulate the release of a hormone. So, for example, within our sympathetic nervous system, this will target a structure known as the adrenal gland. Okay, we'll talk more specifically later about the medulla or the medulla of this adrenal gland. And essentially, what will happen is this will stimulate the adrenal gland to secrete catecholamines. Catecholamines, here are two catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these catecholamines are these two hormones here. So this is the umbrella term, catecholamines. And then we have specific catecholamines such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. The last type of stimulus that will trigger the release of a hormone is a hormonal stimuli. So this is probably the bulk of what we'll talk about in AMP, just because there's so much hormonal stimuli signaling within the endocrine system. And essentially, with hormonal stimuli, what happens is a hormone is released from a gland. It targets another organ or gland and causes that organ or gland to release a hormone. Okay. So for example, this is our hypothalamus up here. Okay. The hypothalamus will produce a hormone. This hormone will then go and target the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary will release a hormone that will, for example, target the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland will produce a hormone that will go off and target a number of cells. Okay, so what we see is this hormone causes this gland to release a hormone. So this is the target of a hormonal stimuli. And then this hormone is released and targets another gland to release another hormone. So this hormone is a hormonal stimuli for T3 and for this gland. Okay? So literally it's a cascading event of hormonal responses. Now, when we look at the effects or the interaction these hormones have on their target cells, okay, you can have multiple hormones act on the same target at the same time, and the result of that binding will have different effects on those cells. So for example, permissiveness. Permissiveness occurs when one hormone can exert its effect without another hormone being present. Okay. A biological example of this would be, for example, estrogen in females causes the expression of progesterone receptors on the uterus. Okay. Therefore, estrogen is permissive to progesterone, right? So in order for progesterone to carry out its function on the uterus, it needs estrogen. Without estrogen, you don't get the progesterone receptors. So you can secrete progesterone, there would be no effect. Okay, that's what we mean by permissiveness. Okay, synergism. Okay, this is where more than one hormone produces the same effect on the target cells. So it's an amplification process. Okay, so for example, our two catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so for example, individually, epinephrine by itself or norepinephrine by itself will increase heart rate. Okay. However, if you secrete both epinephrine and norepinephrine and target the heart, you increase the heart rate even more. So it amplifies. You add the two, it amplifies the response. Okay. The last one is antagonism, right? Most of you guys know what antagonism is, right? It's that brother or that sister, that sibling that annoys the crap out of you. I'm just kidding. Okay. So antagonism is one or more hormones opposes the actions of another. So for example, biologically, when we think about insulin and glucagon, insulin decreases blood glucose, glucagon increases blood glucose. And again, we'll talk about those two hormones here substantially in a little while. Okay, so with those different effects, okay, or interactions of hormones on our target cells.